Today we have with us Professor Thirumal, who will be speaking on Doing Media History, Some Reflections. This talk is based on the Routledge monograph, Modern Mizoram, History, Culture, Poetics. Professor Thirumal is the main author of this 2019 publication, along with his co-authors, Lalithan Puri and Lalruzani. Thirumal Sir is a professor at the department and the Dean of Sarojini Naidu School of Arts and Communication, University of Hyderabad. He has written several influential articles in history and theory of media, enabling histories of technologies and communities, Northeast studies, and discrimination studies. He has published in the Indian Economic and Social History Review, Seminar, and the Economic and Political Weekly, and has written for newspapers and periodicals as well. A link to his latest book will be in the chat shortly. Hello, Thirumal sir. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Devina, Anirudh, Pranay, for inviting me to do this presentation. As some of you may be aware, I've taught this course on media history for more than a decade and a half. Now, during this time, I've developed interest in two broad areas. One is historical studies of media and theoretical studies of media. I thought we could make interesting connections between these two broad areas. In fact, the work of Neumann, Zamy, one in the context of Indian Ocean, other in the context of upland South Asia, which is what is known as the Zomia, is illustrative of this kind of interest. Both of them were building connections between theoretical studies and historical studies in a different geo-historical context. I also think the last week presentation, Sashi's work, can also be read in this manner. The material for today's presentation, Doing Media History, is drawn from a recent work on Mizoram. The book in itself is not specifically about media history, but it articulates some of the concerns that I've just mentioned. I would like to thank my collaborators, Laldini and Lalruzani. I hope they are there for working with me for several years on this book. They've taught me as much as the sources in the book. Special thanks to Laldini for being politely firm about how certain practices need to be interpreted, respecting the sentiments of the community and not to be swayed by the theoretical formulations. It was an educative process. I'll proceed from describing the structure of the book to illustrating one of the substantive chapters. The book has three substantive chapters and they deal with three different cultural objects. One is a cultural event. I'll be focusing on the chapter that deals with the first handwritten newspaper, Mizo Chanchin Laisui. Actually, Zamy and me wrote this as an article for ISHR many years ago, but we have done another version for this book. The first few slides will give a synoptic view of the book, and the last half will focus on the newspaper. This is my first slide, Modern Mizoram. That is the first part of the title. The second part is History, Culture, and Poetics. Actually, this term Modern Mizoram was not given by the authors. It was the advertising wing of Routledge which used this phrase. Nevertheless, it is, we have to defend this in a substantive manner, and so I would like to say a few things about what is modern about Mizoram. The term modern is generally associated with rationality and universality. Now, Zomia symbolizes differences and a sensibility that reduces life to serve political, economic, technological, and social ideals. Now, you see in the slide, whereas when you're writing modern history, we are talking about colonialism, nationalism, or the Indic civilization. Mizoram actually belongs to a region, an upland Southeast region, which is neither an Indic nor the scenic civilizational context. I would also like to mention that the colonial state had a weak presence, by which we are suggesting that the administrative apparatus of colonial state did not actually penetrate into Mizoram. In that it is in that spirit that we would like to look at meso sensibility. I mean, we have used the term meso sensibility. We'll be talking about it in the later slides. For us, the meso sensibility foregrounds existence rather than thought. Likewise, the term modern, when attached to meso, references ontology and not epistemology. The emphasis is on to be or to do, or what may be called as the embodied rationality. There is a certain intensity attached to being meso. So studying cultural works is also about recognizing the intensity and vitality that the cultural work expresses. This is precisely what we do when we describe the eruptive festival, which I'm not going to talk today, that is Kumazai, and the sculpture Peichang. In the next two slides, what I'm going to do is describe how we qualify history when talking about the structure of the book. In the writing of modern Indian history, if you go by Partha Chatterjee, now Partha Chatterjee has theorized the internal causes as inner domain and the external causes as outer domain. In the case of Mizoram, it is not very clear if such a demarcation is possible. We have deployed a productive category, which I just mentioned, meso-sensibility, and this meso-sensibility may be seen as a trans-historical mode of awareness and bonding that neither religion nor state can explain adequately. On the other hand, most works on Northeast are about historical identities associated with religion or the colonial or the post-colonial state. Ours is an attempt to explain certain changes that occurred during colonial rule, primarily through the self-generative cultural work of mesos per se. So in some sense, what we are trying to suggest is neither colonial state nor the Indic civilization has had influence on the period that we are studying Mizoram. So we are trying to explain Mizoram's cultural process through its own ingenious ways of producing culture. So move on to the next slide. Now, writing history, I have just spoken about causality. In this, I'm speaking about a certain method of history which we think we have used. Many historians may not agree that it's a microhistory, but I suspect that there is a certain gesture of doing microhistory of this region. Microhistory of the region is a certain kind of a method where you choose a small time and a small space to work with and a small limited fields of observation. Many of you may be aware Goethe's work, a cockfight ritual in Bali, use that in order to explain the entire working of a society. Now, for us, for instance, the interpretation of this, what we're going to do in the next few minutes, is not merely to study the object per se, but how these objects and identified events illuminate the working of the entire society. I should also inform my friends about the sparse archive. You know, Mizoram doesn't have a huge archive. It's not a literate society. There was no scribal culture. There was no state, so there are no monuments. I remember Prabal Das Gupta once remarked that there are two kinds of archives in India. One was heavy and the other was light and portable. The British found it very difficult to fight the Lushais on the mountains because the Lushais had no immovable property, and they just ran away with the families and livestock by burning the bamboo houses and granaries. Now, microhistories become feasible because of this archival character of historically itinerant societies. They have not produced documents or monuments for historians to work. So their histories are inscribed in bodies, songs, festivals, and cultural practices. It is important to know that the ephemeral nature of these practices and the inherent instability of bodies, including the kind of materials they use. The bamboo is the primary material they use. They continue to use that bamboo. There is a certain ephemerality and inherent instability of the mediums that they use, and the content obviously also becomes, I mean, it cannot be stored for a very long time. The other important feature of doing microhistory is macro histories about state structures, about legal structures, about religious structures, economic structures. They don't adequately explain what happens at micro level. They don't explain the micro level formations, and that is one of the reasons why work on colonialism or work on nationalism will hardly find interesting insights about the Northeast. So macro histories do not throw enough light on a region of this size. So they demand a very different way of a different historical approach, as it were. Go to the next slide. So having qualified what are historical method and approaches, in this slide, I'll just tell you what is a notion of media or cultural artifact that we have, we have used in this book. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the term media was used only in the mid-19th century after the invention of telegraph and phonograph. From the time of Renaissance, the comparable label that was used for media was arts and crafts. Arts and trades included poetry, painting, logic, and rhetoric. All these were seen as media. With the use of the term media, another term which is used alongside media is communication. Media and communication are conflated in some ways. Whereas the terms that were associated with arts and crafts were mimesis and not communication. Now, communication replaced mimesis, and the former is associated with production, whereas the latter was associated with the act of creation. In the Indian scenario, literary historiography, people who have written literary historiography will tell you that these two things go hand in hand. For instance, Stuart Blackburn's work on print and folklore in Tamil settings, historical settings, brings you how these two things go together. In the way we have used this media, we are using media as both communication as well as mimesis. The two different approaches, as you see in the slide, one is historical narrative of objects, events, and processes, which is normally followed by journalists writing media history. They'll say this is the first newspaper, and somebody this is an Englishman who produced this newspaper, or this is the first nationalist who produced this newspaper. There's a certain kind of origin that you look for. In archaeological approach, which actually we use in some ways to talk about the Mizo language, to talk about the Mizo the history of Mizo expressions. The archaeological approach would simply mean that all media is actually reflects the previous media. There is every media is an accretion of some sense. For instance, cinema is consists of not merely cinema not in isolation, but cinema consists of photography. Photography in some sense incorporates painting and so on and so forth. So and that's the way I think we use both these approaches in the way we have written this particular article. Now with these qualifications on history and media, I'll begin my presentation with this newspaper. So here you see the newspaper on your left-hand side. It actually, the 4 issues of this newspaper had come out, and this is the second issue, 4 issues across 2 years. This is the second issue of the newspaper, and the text that you're finding is the preface of the article that Zani and me wrote on how we want to understand this newspaper. I would sure. So one of the things that we want to do with this newspaper is to find out how is this newspaper different from other kinds of newspapers which have come. What is the singularity of this newspaper? What is the university of this newspaper? For instance, it has been looked at as merchandise, it is looked at as text, it is looked at as bourgeois promise, extraction, or somebody like Benedict Anderson has looked at it as giving rise to nationalistic sentiment and so on. But in this context, how do we understand the singularity? Now, the term singular for Deleuze simply means it's neither general nor the particular. In a way, colonialism, capitalism has been established as the general. Now, what is general and what is particular in the way we read newspapers, newspaper history in India? So the general is, you start with Hickey, or maybe that is colonialism and capitalism, that is a general. And what is a particular? And the particular has been perceived as the nationalist or the post-colonial. Now, we have sought to argue that both colonialism and post-colonial as being hegemonic. The difference that we seek to establish is not derived from an infinite play of meaning, but differences emerging from a vital dynamism. Being Mizo is an expression of intensity rather than meaning or value. Now, if you look at post-colonial scholarship, whether it is people like Homi Bhabha and etc., they are looking at the infinite play of meaning and differences, but they're not actually looking at the vital dynamism, that is the intensity of meaning that that people have in relation to themselves and in relation to the world around them. In some sense, this newspaper expresses differences, of course, in meaning, but differences in terms of intensity or vitality. I'll be illustrating that with an example soon. A little bit about the history of this newspaper. So it is a first handwritten Mizo language newspaper in the then Lushai Hills district. The Lushai Hills district was named as Mizo district in 1954. Prior to that, it was known as Lushai Hills district. 4 issues of this newspaper appeared over 2 years. The newspapers were duplicated on carbon copy and circulated. Interestingly, this newspaper arrived 4 years after the Lushai language acquired a script. So this newspaper is actually an experiment in standardizing the Lushai language. What we intend doing with this newspaper is to study not in relation to the making of nation or the making of colonial power, but in the kind of relationship it has with the Mizo society at that very moment. Uh, a little more about the singularity or the university of MCL. Now, it is a historical fact that colonialism introduced both manuscript and print culture in the erstwhile Lushai Hills district. Now, this is a manuscript newspaper, while MCL has inaugurated, in some sense, a productive tension between the ear and eye. There is a gentle prioritizing of the ear or the eye, because the items that are there in this newspaper, one of which I'm going to show, there are only 6 items. 4 of them are news items, 2 are moral anecdotes, and those 4 items refer to agricultural practices, health practices, health practices, and other development kind of news. Now, so in some sense, it is also a project of colonialism. Now, if one were to frame this particular newspaper, because the time in which it was produced, this newspaper was produced, except for 2 Lushais, none of them actually knew how to read or write. So there was neither a reading, a scribal culture before, nor a reading culture. So this newspaper actually represents, in some sense, a visual document. Now, if one were to frame this as a visual document, and use a certain formulation, Heidegger's formulation, what Heidegger would say is in modernity reduces the world to a picture. Now, when he says modernity reduces the world to a picture, what he's saying is Heidegger conceives of modern science as a medium that allows an immersive or an effective experience of the phenomena that disallows, not allows, that disallows an immersive or effective experience of the phenomena that it studies. In a similar sense, the newspaper provides a picture of the Lushai world that prescribes an intense, that limits an intense phenomenological experience. That's not the way they relate to the world. It tells them how to look rather than what to look. Now, this is an excerpt of the translated version of the newspaper. And this is one of the news items. And in this news item, actually, there were 3 people who wrote this newspaper. The Bor Saab was the superintendent himself, and he is part of this news item. He, along with 2 Lushai important people among the Lushais, wrote this piece. Now, this particular item is calling for hunting of all kinds of animals, including tigers, and making the forest into arable land. Now, I would like to read this. We have read this as some kind of this Borsab had knowledge of the cosmology of the people's relationship with tiger, and he's also, against that background, he's giving this summon. So how do you want to read this? Now, colonialism's desire seems to be heterogeneous. In this news item, what you see is a direction from the superintendent of Lushai Hills district, Shakespeare, to clear the forest of wild animals and use that space for agriculture. Now, this may be seen as a sedentarization of a hills people. The list of animals includes tigers too. In the local Lushai cosmology, the tiger is accorded the status of a supreme being. Interestingly, the white official knew about this mythical relation that the Lushais had with the tiger. In a different text, this official expresses his inability to convert this curiosity into knowledge, since he could not participate in the world of Lushais, we interpret the insatiated curiosity of the official as a form of heterogeneous desire of colonialism, and the newspaper representing a plural rather than a homogeneous articulation of colonialism. Colonialism is not just meant for conquest. I mean, here it shows a very different kind of an impulse as a desire. Now, while his command to hunt the tigers is to vacate the mythical space that the tiger occupies in the life world of the Lushais, he understands that world as a Gnostic space, a secret world not available for representation, the unseeable world of the Lushais, the aura of the tiger. He is conscious of the authority of the object and his own authority to kill the tiger, and he recognizes these as two different powers, one of an immersive kind, the other of a coercive kind. So the point I'm making with this excerpt is to say that the colonial officials could not intrude into the life world of the Lushais whenever they wanted to and convert their curiosities into knowledge. They could not datify, I mean, using Usha's term, they could not datify the life world sometimes. I mean, they actually longed to enter that space, but they could not enter that space. They did not have the cultural, what can be called, they're not part of the culture to experience life in the manner they did. This is the last but one slide, and we're posing certain kind of what do you call a theoretical reflection on how you understand this newspaper. Now, if you look at philosophers like Heidegger, Benjamin, and more recently Simondon, they've all identified media in itself as an object of theoretical reflection. But the critical analysis of industrial cultural commodities begins from its difference from an earlier era of products produced from an artisanal era. One of the important points they seem to make is a relation between the artisan work and the medium. Justifiably, they have argued that technological reproduction under capitalism disturbs this relation between artisan work and the medium. However, such an analysis assumes that all societies have produced artisanal class, and such a historical fact does not hold good for the Lushai society. Our analysis of the newspaper seemed to situate the Manuscript newspaper as belonging to both an artisanal world as well as a technological world. Colonialism gives rise to both artisanal and industrial form of production. And these are questions for us to think aloud, and I'll just stop by saying a few words about the sonic, which I've used in a couple of slides. We are persuaded by a certain philosophical understanding that seeing, eye, and visual is considered to have a closure towards a deeper understanding of a body and senses, whereas being in the world, listening, ear, and the acoustic is considered to provide an opening, a positive model of philosophy and thinking towards a body, sense and sense perceptions. And mesosensibility reflects this anti-ocular, what could be called as a sonic modernity. Thank you.
So this presentation foregrounds expressions rather than representations of the Zoo society, and invokes ontology rather than epistemology by doing cultural or media history, shifting the focus towards addressing existence. And I think this was quite the revelation. Thank you so much, Thirumal sir. Yes, and we will now have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants. And sir, I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB Live comment questions towards the end of the meeting. I now request participants to either raise their hands. That's a little icon next to your username. It says raise hand. You can press that and I will be notified that you've raised hand and you want to ask the question. Yes, we already have questions, so that's great. If you can't raise your hand, please let me know that you would like to ask the question via personal message here. Kindly turn on your microphone and or video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. And please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction with Thirumal sir. We will take questions starting now for the next 10 minutes only to manage time better. So we already have the first question from Anjali ma'am. Uh, Ma'am, if you can hear me, please turn on your microphone and video.
Hi, thanks, Professor Thirumal, for that very engaging. My question is related to the excerpt that you presented about the tigers, a reward for killing tigers. Now you say colonialism is not a conquest, and it also has the properties of like a voyeuristic interest in the oppressed, colonized people. So what do you think of the colonial powers not being able to enter that culture, but still being able to disrupt it in some way? Because as you may probably know that over 80,000 tigers were slaughtered in 50 years in the British era in India. So clearly they were able to make some kind of impact, even as they were not part of the culture.
Yeah. I was trying to suggest, theories of colonialism actually suggest that whether you look at Said or other kinds of theories, there is, territorial domination, there is knowledge domination, cultural conquest, there are conquests of different kinds. But I'm suggesting that everything was not conquered and they knew that they could not conquer those spaces. I mean, it is not that the forests have been cleared. It is true. What you're saying is true. They have disrupted. But the point is, they've not been, there is a certain admitting of the fact that they're not able to traverse these spaces. And the admission of not being able to traverse these spaces is also, one needs to understand colonialism as dominant in certain spheres and not very dominant in certain spheres. They couldn't domesticate your life form in every sense of the term. That's the only point that I'm making. The disruption, yes, they did.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anjali ma'am, Thirumal sir. We have Usha ma'am with a question next. If you can hear me, please unmute. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Thirumal, for that insightful talk. I have a question about the archive and the nature of the archive. And you did mention that there is, the tangible and the intangible. You didn't use those words, but that's how I understood it.
Yeah.
The material and the immaterial, perhaps.
Yeah.
So how do the politics of archiving play out? And how does a historian deal with those politics when you're dealing with a digital archive? Because the digitization of archives sort of renders moot in a way that division between the material and the immaterial, right?
Right.
So how do you look at that as a historian?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not a trained historian. It is some...
Yeah. As someone who does history.
Yeah, right. I would like to, in fact, I did mention Susan Ding's work on what she's an art historian, and I've only in a roundabout way answer your question, not directly. Now, Susan Ding's work is on trying to suggest terra cruda is a distinctive material that people have used in South Asia for almost 9,000 years. And terra cruda has not been seen as a distinctive material that people use for religious, for utility purposes, etc. By art historians have not recognized terra cruda as some material that can be used for what do you call for art. Mm-hmm. Now, how do the way she proceeds is she uses some of the text, Indic text, and says the Agama text, I was told, suggests that terra cruda, that is what is unbaked clay, or what can be called as unfired clay, which is inherently unstable, is a very precious material, and that material in itself, because it has moisture, it has connections with the divine in some ways, and it's a most precious material. I mean, it's better than all other materials, including metals put together, it says. Now, I am interested in the question of, are there some ways, as media theories, as media, especially working in different cultural contexts, how do we even study, because the way the West has given us what is material may not be an appropriate thing of how we view that material itself. Now, when you're talking about digital objects, I'm not very sure, under digital archive, I'm not sure how to look at it. But if I were to suggest that digital archive is also in some ways, there are ephemeral products. And there is a certain way this ephemerality is not stable. Now, my interest in that digital object is to theorize this instability. My interest in that is how do you look at the I mean, how do you theorize this object which is not stable in itself? So what has been looked at as archive is only stable objects, enduring materials, enduring representations. Now, the challenge is for us is to look at not so stable stable material. For instance, Susan Bean's work looks at how in the recent years Ganeshas are made of because of ecological concerns, not of terracotta but of terra cruda.
Right.
And they are immediately immersed in the sea and nothing happens. There is now, is it possible from art history, is it possible to use that kind of a theoretical understanding to media? I'm not sure, but I think there is a potential. That could be some way that we can borrow from art history and look at how art historians are trying to give some structure and reasoning for these kinds of materials as well. If digital objects in that sense erases the difference between tangibility and intangibility, as what you're saying, I think that could be, I don't have an answer, but there could be some possibilities of, working with that Susan Bean's idea of terra cruda. I mean, that's something which
No, thank you. I'll definitely look up the work.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have the next question by Shashi. If you could please unmute yourself. You could also come on video for us.
Hi, sir.
Hi.
I had more of a methodological question, sir.
Yeah.
While doing microhistory of the kind that Carlo Ginzburg pioneered, how does one not lose track of the macro historical narrative that might have some kind of a bearing on the archive at hand? So that was something I used to grapple with also. So I just wanted to know.
Yeah. Actually, I think there are different traditions in microhistory, and one tradition, which is basically Italian tradition, I think, they are against this macro data. And but if you look at the German historical tradition as well as this Brodel, I was told, they use historical thing to build up macro data structures.
Okay.
They do both. They do.
Okay.
Why I am interested in this is because I do not want to use either colonialism or nationalism in order to understand a certain space which doesn't really cannot intrude into the life force of the space. So I want to give it a certain agency, a certain what do you call eminence. You know, I want to, in some sense, propose a theory of eminence rather than external theory. That's. But you're right. I mean, microhistories and macrohistories. Sometimes we think they are disconnected, but the German tradition, it looks as if they do connect it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So we have a question from Anirudh, who's a student at the PhD student at the department. He wanted to ask the question live, but his connection is a little unstable.
Okay.
So I'm posting the question here in chat, and I'm also announcing it. First of all, he thanks you for such an interesting session, and his question is, how can one depart from an event-oriented history to pursue a critical and more holistic understanding of history? Histories are not just events or happenings, but they are a more detailed analysis.
Can you come again?
Oh, of course, sir. So, Anirudh is asking, how can we have a more critical and more holistic understanding into histories, rather than just using certain events or happenings, going for a more detailed analysis, trying to unpack those events. So, how can we depart from just event-oriented to a more broad-based historical analysis?
Right. It looks as if studying historiography, there seems to be two kinds of histories. The earlier ones, which is, in fact, the ones which we use in journalism departments, is basically a political history. And political history is about who, as I was just mentioning, the historical narrative of journalists and authors and publishers, etc. But there's a whole lot of the Anal school has asked this question of everyday. Now, everyday history is of a different kind. Every day is not eventful, and every day is very important. And how do you do this? And this is something which I would think is very important. And people are. I could look at some of the subaltern work also as reflecting this kind of a history of everydayness. Some of it as about everydayness. But in media history per se, I wouldn't know how this everyday works. But if somebody is writing on a publishing house or a particular editor, or somebody is writing on Gutenberg's the way he lived, I think that would also be an everyday of a sort. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an adequate answer, but the move from events to day to day is something that has already happened in history, and people do that kind of histories. Yeah.
I was actually reminded of one of your students' works, Anupama.
Yeah.
So she picked up an event that happened, and then she went back several times, almost in an ethnographic approach to getting more broad-based histories of that particular event, more an anthropological sense to the contexts and the local realities.
Yeah, that could, that is in some sense, what are you suggesting? I mean, are you suggesting that is, that's a way of doing microhistory? I mean, would that be a microhistory of a kind? Would that be your formulation? Yeah, I
Yes.
agree with you. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So your, in a way, point of inquiry starts at that event,
Yeah,
but then as you go into the field and you spend a lot of time in the field, interacting with multiple people, other stakeholders,
right,
it sort of
right.
becomes not
Yeah.
just about that event, but things surrounding the event and people and places and like a more richer, deeper analysis, I think.
Yeah, yeah. She does that. It's a rich ethnography. I mean, that's what she has done.
So I'm just looking at the Facebook event as well. We have a lot of viewers there, and I'm just taking a minute to check the Facebook comment questions. And oh, okay. I'm sorry. So Jharna also has a question. I think her internet connection is also not stable, so I'm going to. Well, she's mentioned her question in chat for everyone, but I'll just copy paste it again. She's asking if you're saying that meso sensibility is anti-ocular, if eyes limit or shut out the broader experiences, intangibles. At the same time, eyes also feed the body with facts and complement to supplement the total experience. So, how reliable is that sequence? So she's asking.
Okay, I think that's a very very strong view to take, but what we mean by like the sonic would not just mean you only listen with your ears, but you listen to your thought, you listen to your touch, you listen to almost everything that you do. It's that listening happens in almost all spheres of senses. Listening in that sense, the sonic in that sense is multisensorial. It is in that sense I've used the term sonic. And it is in that sense that I'm trying to pit it against what Heidegger would call as the reduction of the world to a picture. I mean, that's one of the that's formulation of Heidegger. It takes on that formulation by arguing that the listening does not mean just listening to the ear, but you listen to your thoughts, you listen to your feelings, you listen to your touch, you listen to all the different senses. Listening is very central. The sonic is very central to your way of being. I mean, that's one way of answering a question. I'm not saying the eye is something that doesn't do anything at all, but the sonic is something that allows a more fuller being, a more fuller existence, as it were.
Absolutely. So, yeah, a more holistic way of the sonic. These are all the questions that we have for you today, sir.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you, Devina.